I've always had the good fortune of working in academic settings. A lot of my ministry, therefore, has been with and among students. And of course, those students have big dreams of high-paying jobs and powerful positions. So around April of every year, they'd start interviewing for these positions and internships and would come to me from time to time for interview advice, even occasionally to set up mock interviews. It's very fun. I love to do those. So they would put on their best power suits, you know what they look like, and they'd show up prepared for anything. I would begin, "So tell me just a little bit about yourself." It's fascinating what happens when you invite someone to tell me a little bit about yourself. Some have even suggested that this is the most difficult and the most telling of all interview questions. Where do you begin? Do you begin with where you were born and track all the way until your mid-20s? Do you start with your gifts and your passions? Or do you begin with your hopes and your dreams? What do you say to tell people about yourself? Another way to ask the question might be, "Tell me who you are." At the heart of this question is identity. Identity. Whether we are a hopeful college student or someone facing retirement, it's something that we all have to deal with and manage. What makes you, you? What makes us, us? So it's good that today's readings are here at the beginning of the year, because so many people right now are evaluating what their life looks like. I don't know if you've heard about the Great Resignation. The Great Resignation is something that's happened over the last year and a half during the pandemic, in which so many people have shifted their jobs, quit their jobs, taken early retirement, all in an effort to reevaluate what's important. The pandemic has afforded some of us with this opportunity, and it's caused a ripple in the workforce. But it does say to me that we are thinking about what matters. And the Great Resignation I do not bring up because Jesus by no way is resigning. If you notice, he's just getting started. He hasn't done a thing yet except grow up. But we begin with these words of his baptism. So let's see what this baptism has to say about Jesus' identity and about our identity. And I'm going to point two things out, and then I'm going to start my sermon. So the first thing that I want to point out is that you have to notice here, a big part of this identity forming place for Jesus is that John is not there. John is absent. And this is important because all of Luke up until now has been weaving John and Jesus together. Their families are together. Elizabeth and Mary hang out to eat with each other during their pregnancy. They come about these pregnancies in extraordinary ways. So John and Jesus and their families have really been structured as a unit. But if you notice, John is not present at this baptism. Look at the citation in your bulletin right now. And you'll see something. It's Luke 3, what? Comma. And then what? All right, so something's missing, right? And what's missing is that John has been thrown in jail. Remember back on Advent 3 when we talked about John calling people brood of vipers, and he was telling everybody to be fair and to be kind and not to be a bully? Well, that ticked off the authorities and they threw him in jail. And now we're picking up the story with this baptism. So those missing lines explain that John is not there, and it sets Jesus in a position to do this ministry all on his own. So his identity is now established separate from John. And then, in case Jesus is suffering from some sort of identity crisis, a voice comes from heaven and says, "You are my son." You. Not "this is my son," but "you are my son, my beloved." Now, the second thing to notice is that all of this happens in and around water. And something to keep in mind here is that there are all kinds of baptisms floating around in ancient Israel in Jesus' day. There were all kinds of baptisms that were meant to prepare people for coming more fully into the presence of God. So baptisms were there to wash people of any sort of physical impurity or some sort of spiritual impurity. People would have known about baptisms. Remember, John was a baptizer. That was his job. So this would not have been an unfamiliar scene. So what is it that makes Jesus' baptism so unusual? What is different about this one? Well, I think that the most interesting part is that what Jesus is doing is taking this baptism, and the Spirit that John has been talking about enters into it in a different way. And that is the same Spirit that was around at Pentecost and that we hear about in the book of Acts. So the cool thing is that the Spirit wasn't just sent down just for Jesus. That's the same Spirit that's around and has been around and is still around. So what Jesus does in this baptism is he takes all of life and he grounds himself in humanity. He grounds himself in our lives together. That's the work of the Spirit, and Jesus is a part of that. And then notice that Jesus does all of this in water. And back in that day, water was a symbol of chaos and confusion. But after the baptism, what does Jesus begin to do with water? He walks on it. He turns water into wine. He calms the waves and he stills the storms. So Jesus is claiming his identity as the Lord of all creation. So this baptism is a little bit different. And it sets him within the spiritual framework of humanity. He takes this common ritual and connects himself to all of those around him. Just like he'll do on the cross, he's joining his life to our life. And this is why being a part of Jesus is so much a part of our identity. If identity is being the same as, that's what the word means. It comes from a word meaning to identify with, means to be the same as. If identity is being the same as, then we certainly want to be the same as Jesus, don't we? But it's easy to lose sight of that. It's much easier to identify, to be the same as something else. Strangely, it's easier to identify with power. It's easier to identify with powerful positions. It's easier to identify to be the same as money. It's easier to identify with praise and adoration. It's easier to be the same as these things and less easy to be the same as Jesus, whom God calls beloved and good. So as a result of trying to be the same as these other things, we can forget that we are good. Before our first job interview, before our first paycheck, before our first award, before anything, God has called us good. Good. And if baptism does nothing else, it centers our beauty and our goodness. I spent some time as a camp counselor in my early 20s. And along with another counselor, I was the overseer of 12 young boys, age 13 to 15. I did not sign up for this age group. It was never my intention. But this was the age group I was assigned. And as you can imagine, these young teenagers were a handful. Most came from very wealthy families. And they knew everything. And they had done everything. And they knew it a lot better than I did. They were not without healthy egos. But they were good kids. They really, really were. But I do remember that there was one young man who was really problematic. He just went too far. He pushed too hard. His comments were too abrasive. He was offensive, and the other kids began to shut him out. So after a particularly hard night fueled by fudgesicles and caffeine, this young person really acted out in a significant way, and I had to have what we called a front porch talk. And so with his arms crossed, I explained all that I had experienced and observed, and I talked about consequences. Still nothing. You know the stance. And finally, I just said, look, I see you, and I like you, and you are good. And that's when he lost it. The tears came, the anger came, more tears came. And ultimately, he calmed down and talked to me about his family, his parents, his difficulties in school, and he became real. But he became real only when he heard that he was good. I wonder what it is about being good that is so easy to forget, but at the same time is so liberating. So as I think about that guy, I think about Frederick Buechner's definition of baptism. Buechner says that going under the water symbolizes the end of everything about your life that is less than human. Coming up again symbolizes the beginning in you of something strange and new and hopeful, and you can breathe again. So I don't know who was baptized on that front porch that night, him or me, but it was the same Spirit at work that was at work then with Jesus and is at work now with every single one of us. So today we celebrate the baptism of Jesus. That's what we do on this first Sunday after Epiphany. And during the season of Epiphany, we learn how God is made known in the person of Jesus. And the first sign that we have is this baptism. And baptisms and all the sacraments reveal something that is hidden. And sacraments make it real. And for us, the thing that is revealed in baptism is God's love and our goodness. It reveals that each of us is holy. And in our tradition or any tradition, it is the invitation to come up out of the water and breathe. We breathe in our identity. We breathe in our connection to each other. We breathe in that which we have forgotten. Oh, I forgot what it felt like to laugh. I forgot what it felt like to cry. I forgot what it felt like to feel secure. I forgot what it felt like to be surrounded by people I love. I forgot what it felt like to be excited. These are baptisms. The movements of the Spirit reminding us that God delights in us and wants the very best for you. So I can't help but repeat those words from the prophet Isaiah, those beautiful, beautiful words. Thus says the Lord who created you, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I shall be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. For I am the Lord your God. You are precious in my sight, and I love you. This is the only place in the Bible where God says, I love you. We are not alone. We are not alone as we move through this pandemic or this time of indecision. We are not alone as we struggle with who we are and what our lives are about. We are not alone as we struggle to find meaning in the midst of messiness. We are not alone as we wrestle with what pulls us and tempts us. We are not alone. As one preacher reminds us, Jesus went into the water and came out again, and so indeed shall we. So shall we. So, my friends, we continue to wade in the waters. We wade in the waters of life and in the waters of baptism, and luckily and mercifully, those waters pass through this church, around that font, and underneath that altar, shaping us at every twist and turn. And it is here that our identity is formed by the prayers and promises that we will soon offer. And it is here that we will forever learn and forever grow our response to that simple, mysterious question, one that Jesus himself will one day ask every single one of us. Who are you? Won't you tell me just a little bit about yourself?